Hi, I'm Nick Hall. I'm the founder of the Digital Tourism Think Tank. I'm 32 years old and I'm a British guy who grew up in London and have lived in Brussels for the last 8 years. And before I give any more on my views about the EU, I should also say that I do not work in politics or with any EU institutions. I decided to make this video because I've seen so much that has got me angry, and I think, like many people who feel strongly that Britain should stay within the EU, they haven't actually made their voices clear, because ultimately it's not something that they are really passionate about in the same way that the many people who want to leave the EU feel strongly to express their views. But here it is. I asked people on Facebook to send me their questions, and I had a feel for what people were undecided about. So I'm putting across my view in the hope that it will help you to make up your mind before the referendum. So here it is. Let's touch on the different subjects which are really, really hot in this referendum debate. And obviously, the biggest topic is immigration. So everyone talks about immigration like it is something which is crippling Britain. And I do understand this. I understand why people say this. I understand where this came from. But the reality is really quite different to what people will talk about. The reality today is that Britain is a multicultural country. It has really, really prospered thanks to EU migration. And frankly, only a few years ago, before the referendum was a subject in the British news, the idea of referring to French, Spanish, Italians as migrants would have been quite absurd. It would have been something that would have seemed in some way a little bit discriminatory and a little bit wrong, because these are people who have made huge contributions to everything that we have in society. And you only need to go to a local restaurant, a local coffee shop to realize that actually it's people from all over Europe who are not just running these places, but are actually making them great experiences. They're very social, they actually contribute a huge amount to the economy. So the thing I hear all the time is that the NHS can't cope anymore, and that schools are already suffering and we can't cope with more migrants. Of course, if you say this to people, it's natural that your emotional reaction to those sort of comments will be, first of all, that you agree the NHS can't cope, and secondly, that the schools definitely can't cope with more people coming in. In fact, I would agree with that as well. But the problem in this argument is that the problems with the NHS and schools don't actually stem from migration. They stem from really, really, really poor investment in public services. And when you voted in the last election for the current government, they made a pretty firm pledge to cut public services further in view of austerity. So the result of that is that public services have huge amounts of money taken out of them, whilst at the same time, if the population is increasing, because actually people think Britain is a great country, they don't come here for benefits, they come here because they actually think it's a fantastic place to live, they want to be part of that society, and they want to be part of that economy. What happens is these people are paying taxes. And so if you have a population increase of 0.5% or 1%, then that means you also have increased tax revenues from these people. So if you're angry about why the health service or the schools cannot cope, that anger should be directed directly at the government for why they haven't increased the spend in public services. In fact, migrants who come to this country, wherever they're coming from, they contribute a lot in revenue. And that money is not being put back into the public services. That, in my opinion, is an absolute scandal. And unfortunately, the debate has been turned towards one of blame rather than actually looking at the government and saying, well, if you have extra revenue, why are you not spending it on making the hospitals and schools much, much better? So that's the first thing I want to say. Secondly, the reason I introduced myself and what I do, the fact that I run a business, is because I am not someone who comes from a wealthy background. I think I come from fairly humble beginnings, and I've made my success in business through working really, really hard and taking advantage of the opportunities that I have sought and that I have seen. When I was young, around 23, 24, I actually saw a great opportunity to move to Brussels to work in the tourism industry. This was simply, to me, as a young person, a fantastic job and a chance to live in another country. And so I took that, and I made something brilliant out of that opportunity. This, guys, is freedom of movement. This is immigration. I went to Belgium, I went to Brussels, because I saw a great opportunity. And in this country, I now am an immigrant. So I would not like to hear people in Belgium talking about British immigrants stealing the public services, filling up the schools. I would think that would be quite wrong. So out of that opportunity, I've managed to now build a business. I now invested back in the UK by building a really successful business. We have 5 members of staff, all coming from different European countries. And this team and this eclectic mix of people from different countries is actually not only what makes our business great, but it's what makes it really, really successful. Because I, as a small business, can benefit from different nationalities and all the differences that they can contribute. I actually make this video only a day or two after speaking with my staff and getting their views on it. And we often don't see the other side of this debate. But as Germans and Italians that have moved to Britain, they actually feel very angry. They feel angry that, first of all, they don't have a right to vote in this debate, when actually they have been living here, contributing, paying tax for many years in Britain. But also because they do pay all this tax and they basically don't touch the public services. And they're not just an exception, they're not one of just a few exceptions. They are the norm, they are the mainstream. What often happens is, and I can certainly talk for Italians, is they often graduate and then come to Britain and then work in coffee shops, sometimes go into great positions in creative companies. They bring something really special. They pay tax, they pay a lot of tax, and that is profit for the country that's not invested back in the public services. Now, a little bit of anecdotal fluff around this whole story is that all of my staff at some point have been ill, whether it's a dentist or needing to go to a doctor or needing to have specialist treatment. Every single one of them, when they get ill, they jump on a plane and they go back home, because they also say the NHS is terrible, it's worse than healthcare in their own countries, and they wouldn't want to use it. So if you think about that, this is supposedly immigrants who are actually contributing something great. They don't see themselves as different to the rest of British society, and they don't use, and they're not a drain on the public services in the way that people like to portray them as. And it's quite an injustice that this is the language and the message which is put out there. I certainly wouldn't like to be referring to a fellow person from Paris or Milan or wherever else as a migrant when I see them just like you and I. So that's my views on the immigration debate. Now the second thing on the immigration debate is that, of course, there is a migration crisis happening all over the world. If any of you pay attention to the news, you'll have seen that world migration figures, that's not Britain, that's not even Europe, are the highest they've ever been. And so there really is a lot of crisis happening in the world. What happens in Syria and what happens in all these other war-torn parts of the world surprisingly doesn't actually end up on the shores of Britain, as sometimes we're made to fear. In fact, whether you like it or don't like it, and I'm not going to cast an opinion on that, the British government has been very, very, very firm in saying people cannot just migrate from places like Syria into the UK. And I'm telling you, as somebody who travels in and out of the UK more or less every other day of the week, that it is near impossible to enter the UK without legal rights to do so. And so if you're a Syrian and you want to move to the UK, good luck is basically the answer. When you go to Calais, you'll see the huge, huge, huge enforcements that have been made to stop illegal migration. You now have a triple barbed wire fence with dogs and watchtowers all around Calais. It is absolutely impossible to get into the country illegally. So just think about that. We don't see that story, but actually the government reacted to people's concerns and they really, really tightened up security there. So that's my view on the immigration debate. Moving on to some of the other things that have come up in this is I've heard this notion of sovereignty thrown about, like we somehow don't have the right to govern our own country. First of all, something my grandfather actually told me, and he's exactly right. And by the way, he has lived through World War II and he fought in World War II. And he certainly has a lot of opinions on everything. But something my granddad really shared with me from a very young age, and I think he's completely right, is that actually if you look at how the European Union operates, it is a beacon for the world's most democratic institution. So that's the first thing, to say it really clearly. A lot of people are casting judgment on the EU based on headlines which say we should take back our sovereignty, we should have the right to make our own laws. And of course, it's like immigration. If I say to you, should you have the right to make your own laws, your natural answer will be, yeah, of course we should. We should have the right to make our own laws and we should take that back. But the reality is that the European Union is a democratic institution. And to explain how democratic that is, every single Prime Minister in the European Union is around the table and it has the right to vote, to veto, to be involved in every law that's made in the European Union. Secondly, you elect your own MEPs, and I bet nobody watching this can name the MEP they voted for, or in fact if they even voted for the MEP in the last local European elections. So if you don't engage in the political process, if you're not part of a democratic process of actually even voting for your member of the European Parliament, then how can you possibly complain about the outcomes that they produce? And when it comes to parties like UKIP, they have actually not contributed positively to the decision-making process in the European Parliament. In fact, you're actually voting for someone who doesn't want to be part of that process. So you can't possibly complain about the outcomes if they don't achieve anything which is in your way or representing your views. So first thing really is to say that the EU is made up of elected individuals, and those individuals are supposed to be chosen by you. And if you don't do that, that's your loss and your mistake for not doing that. Secondly, it is a very transparent institution. So just Google European Parliament live stream and you'll be able to connect live in any language actually to see all the debates and discussions happening in real time. So you can see exactly how the European Union functions and how politics are debated in a completely transparent way. So to suggest that somehow it's an institution with lots of corruption is absolute rubbish. There's huge amounts of work. In fact, if there is one criticism of bureaucracy, it's sometimes there's so much bureaucracy to ensure there's no corruption that the bureaucracy to ensure there's no corruption can sometimes create a lot of paperwork for everybody who's involved in it. But this isn't something that you as a regular citizen should really be too concerned about. Now, when it comes to making our own laws, we sometimes can be led to believe that we can't make our own laws. But just ask yourself when we were not able to make our own laws. We have our own government, we have our own parliament, they make their own laws, and one of those laws and acting on that sovereignty has been to hold this referendum. They've given the ultimate right of choice to the British citizens. So to suggest that somehow we are not able to make our own laws is just absolutely, fundamentally wrong. So statistics say that around 12% of UK laws are made at a European level, and this is more or less true. What that really means is that there are certain laws which should be applied beyond just one country, where it makes more sense to do so. So there's laws, for example, on restricting the maximum number of hours that someone can be forced to or asked to work in a single week, or protecting workers' rights so they can't be exploited by their employers, so they can't be hired, say, in Romania and paid a Romanian salary in Britain. This is actually making complete sense for anybody who wants fundamental rights, believes in fundamental principles, and actually can recognize that almost always these laws are set up to give better consumer protection, better worker protection, to actually improve the quality of your life, and more importantly, to make sure that employers cannot exploit your own rights at an individual level. And this spreads across a lot of different things, but laws are not made to make your life hell. Now, when it comes to some of the things which come out of this institution, of course, I think they're not very good at PR, we can see that, but there are so many benefits that you just don't even realize in your daily life. So we're all used to traveling all over Europe without paying a huge amount for airfares, but we never seem to ask ourselves why that is. The EU, along with the freedom of movement, also believe that there should be the freedom for companies to trade in other countries without being discriminated, without having to overcome tariffs and go through certain barriers. And one of the biggest achievements has been Open Skies. It's an agreement across the EU which allows any airline to operate within any country, to and from any place, without any kind of barriers or anything getting in the way. And that is why you can get on an EasyJet or Ryanair flight for £8 or £9 and fly all the way to, say, Athens, or go on your summer holiday in Spain, or go on a city trip to, say, Paris, without having to pay an absolute fortune. This is something which has transformed your lives as citizens, and I don't believe there's anybody who watches this who hasn't been able to take advantage of that. When we then look at holidays, from next year, and it's again something that mobile phone operators have taken all the credit for, but in reality it's nothing to do with the mobile phone operators, you can now travel with your mobile and you don't pay a fortune in roaming costs. And next year there won't be any roaming charges at all. So when you go on holiday, you will not pay anything different to what you would have paid at home. This isn't a Vodafone passport deal, as you have been led to believe it is. This is because the EU has continuously put restrictions so that as a citizen, your consumer rights allow you to travel freely in any country without being penalized for being a citizen of another country. I can tell you that these rules are not something we should take for granted. I recently went to the Faroe Islands and I saw just what it is to be outside of the EU. They have one airline, more or less, operating, and the price of flights there is astronomical because they're not part of the same region, same area, and they don't have the same protection that we would have inside the EU. So, other issues which seem to really upset people are related to things like, I had a question about the European Court of Human Rights and whether we should be able to deport criminals. So there's this big famous case, there's a couple of famous cases about this terrorist, Abu Qatada, who everybody wanted to deport. I wanted, he should be deported. This guy is vile and should definitely not be in the UK. And of course the story was that we can't deport him because of Europe. But the reality is, first of all, that he's a Jordanian citizen that was first of all given citizenship by the UK government. So we should be asking ourselves why the UK government has made such poor judgments in giving citizenship to terrorists. The second thing is, it's nothing to do with the EU that this guy could not be deported. It's because of the Council of Europe and the European Convention of Human Rights, which is nothing, it's not the same as the EU. So if you leave the EU, you're still bound to the Council of Europe and the European Court of Human Rights. So guys, if you think that dealing with this will be leaving the EU, unfortunately it won't change a thing. And there's around 50, I don't have my facts exactly straight, but around 50 countries that are part of the Council of Europe, and it would be absolutely unprecedented to leave that because it includes a lot of protections, such as abolishing the death penalty and things that most people, even if they feel now and again that they would like to bring something like that back or they would like to do something else, they are fundamental principles. They're the bedrock of our culture and our society that we shouldn't actually go away from. And we shouldn't give up these basic rights which protect us again and again and again. And there's millions of cases where Brits have actually been able to go further, to go to a European court, to have their case heard, and they've actually been successful, where actually our rights are being protected by these laws. So sometimes it's very easy to get caught up on an emotional subject where we would all agree that someone like that should be deported and he's a vile character. But on the other hand, it's not always as simple as that. You can't send someone back to a country which is going to torture them, even if you don't really care if they get tortured. Sometimes you just can't go around that principle. So, sometimes these matters are much more complicated than the headlines will lead you to believe. And often people mix up the European Union with other institutions. And what are we going to do as a country? Are we going to leave every single political body, every single thing like NATO, and just go it on our own? I mean, that's crazy. We can't be an island which just leaves everything and has almost arrogance that we can just do everything on our own. It's just not the reality of the 21st century. So the last thing I want to say is about the economy. So obviously, I think most people watching this have heard all of these statistics which say why we should stay in the EU. And for some reason, people seem to just dismiss them all. So if you don't want to believe it, you just say, scaremongering, it's not real, it's rubbish. But why do you say that? Do you have any logical reason why you dismiss the expert opinion of hundreds of scientists, of hundreds of economists, of every single world leader, of anybody of any serious credibility? Why on earth do you routinely dismiss this as scaremongering? It's not scaremongering, it's the reality. And the fact of the matter is, and I can tell you this as a small business owner, that we operate in both the UK and the EU. The value of the sterling has plummeted as a result of the prospect of us leaving the EU. And this is just on the prospect. So if we were actually to leave, the damage would be catastrophic. And I really think this has actually been understated. That's my honest belief. I think we're going to see a housing crash. I think we're going to see some real disasters when it comes to the economic consequences of this. And I think even if you think we can survive on our own and we don't need the EU, you shouldn't underestimate the shock that that would cause to the economy and the damage that uncertainty does. That alone, even if you negotiate everything how you want to negotiate it, that alone will absolutely wreck the economy. So I can't really understand why anybody would think that that would be a good thing to do, and why anybody would want to actually create poverty when there's no need to do that. I can certainly speak for myself that as a small business owner, we are really actively looking at what happens, and if we leave the EU, it's a very serious consideration now to actually move the company outside of the UK. And if I'm saying that as a small business, can you just imagine what all the businesses that have made their headquarters in London because they see it as the gateway to all the European countries, to 500 million people, can you just imagine what they're going to be thinking? Of course, they will no longer see London as the gateway to all of these people and this huge market. So I really do believe the economic consequences are absolutely real. So there's only a few of my personal thoughts on this subject. I'm sure I have lots more. If you ask me any questions, I would definitely be happy to give my opinion. But I'm just sharing my opinion how I see it, and how I see it every day, working with so-called migrants who I absolutely don't consider as immigrants. I consider them as human beings who really have something brilliant to contribute, and they've made an opportunity in Britain. I see the economic damage immediately already, and we haven't even left, but just the prospect of that. And frankly, I see a lot of hot air and rubbish being said, which is just untrue. So just think very carefully before you vote, and make sure that you really do check up on the facts, and don't just vote on emotion, or vote on what you said, or vote on what seemingly sensible people seem to say. You have to look into the detail and make up the decision based on hard facts.